least if you're in my time zone. Let me show my slide deck. Here we go. I'm going to give you a presentation about Spring Boot Migrator, and it's going to be about automated code migrations. I'm father of two. Actually, I became father of a little baby girl last Wednesday, which gave me quite some turbulences and probably made me shift my priorities a bit. So buckle up. We might experience some turbulences during this presentation as well. Let's see how this goes. I'm from Frankfurt, the city with a big airport in Germany. We're very proud about our skyscrapers, and we're famous for producing apple wine, which is made out of apples and goes into these jars, and then we drink them from small glasses called Charybdis. I'm a Spring enthusiast since around about 2006 when I finished my studies. Back then with Spring XML, and then later on, obviously moved to Spring Boot. I'm working for VMware since 2019. I've been freelancing consultant before that time. And end of 2020, I had the chance to rotate into the Spring team to look into a project which was about automated code migrations, which became Spring Boot Migrator later on. And beginning 2021, I joined the Spring Boot team as the Spring Boot Migrator lead. So if something's not working, it's most probably my fault. What is the problem that we try to solve here? It's actually a setup problem. One obvious, that's also given in the name Spring Boot Migrator, is migrating from some non-Spring technology to Spring Boot. Actually, examples could be something like from JE to Spring Boot, something I'm going to demo you in a while. Other things might be legacy Spring, like coming from legacy Spring XML migration to big Spring Boot, for example, or something we looked into in the past was MuleSoft to Spring integration migration, which worked pretty well. The problems in this area are that a lot of the work is mainly mapping programming models. For example, from stateless EJBs to Spring services or any other migrations. We're going to look into these in a demo that I'm going to run. The problem is also that it's going to be repetitive and tedious work. Maybe it's fun if you migrate one application, one JE application to Spring Boot, but if you're going to migrate the 10th, it's not going to be fun anymore. And probably the biggest problem is that the whole thing is very costly and without an additional business value. I mean, sure, maybe applications run faster, you have different possibilities to roll the application if you're going to migrate to a more modern tech stack, but from a customer perspective, there is no change, at least in the beginning, and that's kind of a problem. Another thing that we looked into with Spring Boot Migrator is introducing new Spring modules. An example could be you're moving your application from or into a microservice and you want to externalize your configuration, and you plan to integrate Spring Cloud config server to externalize your properties. That could be something that Spring Boot Migrator is capable of. Introducing something like Spring Cloud Contract, for example, is something I looked into recently, or something that's on the back of our mind is checking and adding resilience to your endpoints. And again, the problem is no immediate benefit for the customer, even though it's obviously a benefit for your application. And you might build new features on top of this. And the other thing, it often requires a solid understanding of the module that you want to integrate, and can be, especially if you have a full-blown and large application, it can be daunting to move or integrate, for example, Spring Cloud config server. And if you face problems, again, especially in large applications, it's sometimes hard to find these, and that's something where Spring Boot Migrator could be helpful. Another pretty obvious problem, especially with the new Spring Boot 3.0 release coming in November, is that nowadays Java, as well as Spring Boot and other frameworks, they tend to release often, very often actually. I checked the releases for minor Spring framework, for example, and it was every 2 to 4 weeks there was a minor release. Every 6 months, every year a new major release with potentially breaking changes. And even Java is like changing every 6 months to a new version. So it's really hard to keep up with these changes. On the other hand, it's really important to keep up because not upgrading would imply security risks and potentially technical debt. Again, it's cumbersome and tedious, right? You don't really provide new value to the customer. You just try to keep the pace with new releases. So that's kind of the problem space that we wanted to look into with Spring Boot Migrator, or that we are targeting. And the solution for these problems can, and from my point of view, should be automation, because all these problems can, at least in parts, that's important from my point of view, at least in parts, be automated. So that's what Spring Boot Migrator tries to do. Our mission statement that we created back then was Spring Boot Migrator aims to help developers upgrade or migrate to Spring Boot by providing recipes for automated migration. So that's kind of what we try to achieve with this tool. A little bit of history. As I mentioned, I rotated into the Spring team to look into this project. We built on a prototype that has been there, which was working with regular expressions, and we built on top of it. We took some ideas out of this proof of concept and then created something new from scratch. So that was incubating Q4 2020. Back then with the VMware Tanzu Labs team, so that was not Spring by that time, and then it moved to the Spring team. And actually it became an opinionated API for migrations to Spring Boot, or all sorts of migrations. Could also be highlighting problems that you're having with your application, something I didn't mention before, but that's another use case that we thought about looking into. In this time, in this Q4 in 2020, we realized that I mean, it was kind of obvious that regular expressions won't be enough to do the job. So we decided to use a proper Java parser and switch to Java parser, which is a GitHub project. After a while, we realized, okay, type resolution of Java parser is not enough. It was possible, for example, if we found an annotation with a not full qualified pass with an unqualified name, it was not possible to find out which type it actually is. And just by this time, John Schneider, who was leaving the Spring Boot team to create his own startup called Modern, and they created a very, very powerful parser and migration tool, which is called OpenRewrite. It's open source. If you look into GitHub, you're going to find it. And we tried to integrate OpenRewrite, which has a quite different execution model, into SBM, which worked after a while. And since then, we're building on top of OpenRewrite. In 2021, as I mentioned, I took the lead for the Spring Boot Migrate project, and since then, I'm driving it. In March 2022, so it took quite a while, we decided to open source what we had so far under Spring Boot Spring Projects Experimental, which is a dedicated repository for experimental projects. And you can find it there. I'm going to show you the GitHub repo later on. Spring builds on top, as I mentioned, builds on top of OpenRewrite, and we are able to run OpenRewrite recipes through SBM. Plus, we're having an slightly different, or not slightly, but very specialized API for Spring Boot migrations. I'm going to come back, or hopefully come back, to OpenRewrite later on, if we have enough time. As I mentioned, I didn't really have a chance to prepare this talk, so it's kind of freestyle, but we are going to manage. So what we have so far in Spring Boot Migrator, the first time, or the first 3 months, or 3 to 6 months, we looked into JE to Spring Boot migrations, which made us look into JSF and servlet migrations. These are more on the unstable end of recipes. There are other things like migrating local status EJB in 3.0, like annotation-driven EJBs to Spring Boot. They are more on the stable side. So I think you could use this in your application, hopefully. And actually, we managed to migrate a full-blown WebSphere EJB, not EJB, JE application to Spring Boot. Something I'm going to show you in a very small demo in a second. As I mentioned, for a fairly large customer, we looked into Mule to Spring integration. They want to get away from Mule, and we tried to use Spring Boot Migrator in combination with another tool. It's called CSA, stands for Cloud Suitability Analyzer, another tool you can find online in GitHub. It's open source, where you can analyze applications and then kind of create buckets about similar applications. And the idea would have been to look at the most simplest application and then go from there and create new recipes, so that after a while, you hopefully would be able to at least, or maybe migrate the whole set of applications or just parts of it, and you take some burden of the developer to do the transition from one coding model to another coding model by themselves. That was quite successful, and we're still looking into this. And then there is another large pillar, which is basically Spring or Spring Boot to Spring Boot, something like adding modules, or as I mentioned, something we're looking into right now, the Spring Boot upgrade from 2.7 to 3.0. That's going to be big, and we want to make it easier for Spring users to do this migration. So if you have the chance, maybe another word. As I mentioned, I was short on time. So there is no release. I wanted to make a release yesterday, which I didn't manage to do. I won't promise that I'm going to do a new release this week. If it's out, I would be very thankful if you're having Spring Boot 2.7 applications, if you could give it a spin and see if it works. And if something doesn't work, which actually I expect, add an issue to our GitHub. So that would be very, very nice of you and would help us tremendously. Okay, demo time. Take your popcorn. Let's see how this goes. I'm trying to show you a migration from, oops, wrong screen. Better. Very simple application that I took from the Tommy application server examples. It's called Movie Fun Rest. I had to change some things, but it's pretty close to the original application. One thing I had to do, this application was using a Tommy deployment descriptor, as far as I understood. That's something SBM doesn't know about. We know about WebSphere deployment descriptors, for example. So one thing I had to do, I had to copy the data source configuration over to the persistence XML, because that's what SBM expects. And I had to take it out of the reactor build and make it a single project, meaning it's under Git and it has a POM XML, which has no parent so far. So that's the application. Yeah, it's maybe a few words about what to expect there. It's basically a REST API, which loads a set of movies into a database, the database in an H2 in-memory database that has an EJB, which provides the business logic, which is fairly small. And it has a REST layer, a REST endpoint, which allows us to add movies and query movies and modify movies, actually. Okay. So I won't go into the JE stuff too far, because we're going to see what SBM migrates in a second. What we need to do, maybe I'll check some word, wait a sec. There is a commands.txt. So Spring Boot Migrator comes with a shell, Spring Shell, basically, where you can steer the application. And it works in a way that you start the application, then you scan a project, that will be the first command, and then you can run a set of recipes, and they're going to do migrations. And after each recipe, a Git is going to be done, a commit is going to be done, so you have the changes in your Git repo and your history. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go and start Spring Boot Migrator with this file provided. So these commands are in file command.txt. And if I run, well, I think I'm missing a dash here. I had this feeling. Here we go. So instead of me adding all the commands now, it's going to take the commands out of this commands.txt file and First thing, it's going to scan the application. So we need to provide the path to the application it's going to be scanned. In this case, it's the movie from REST application that I just showed you. First thing is going to happen, SBM is going to do some precondition checks, checks that an POM XML is there, verifies that Git support is there, required Java version is correct, and so on and so forth. And then it already started to apply in these recipes, right? Just say apply and provide the recipe name. And then you can see while the recipe runs, it gives us some information about the actions. So a recipe is basically a set of actions that are going to apply to the application. What we are going to do here, first thing is we initialize Spring Boot migration. I'm going to show you what changed as soon as the migration is done and we look into the Git log. Next thing we are going to migrate, we go from bottom to top. We're going to migrate the JPA layer, migrate stateless EJBs, and then in the last step, we're going to migrate JAVAPRO REST endpoints. So Spring Boot Migrator is finished. It ran these 4 recipes. And as you can see, everything looks broken. So if we update dependency, things should be better. There is still a problem with this auto-wired, something to look into. The dependency is there, everything's there, it's just the input was not added. So apologies. What happened? I hope you can see this. I think you can't give me feedback. I hope that's large enough. As we can see, we had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 commits. That's another problem here. I had to run this recipe twice, but it's going to be fixed. First thing that happened is we've been we've been initializing Spring Boot application, meaning a Spring Boot starter main class has been added, the test corner has been added, and an empty application properties file was added. Plus, the packaging type was changed to jar as a default here, and Spring Boot Maven plugin was added, and JUnit was removed because it's coming with Spring Boot starter test. Spring Boot starter test has been added, and Spring Boot starter has been added. So everything we need in the first step to make an application Spring Boot application. Next I did was running the JPA migration. What happened here is Spring is capable of running plain JPA under the hood, so you don't have to use repositories. That's easy for us. It's the easiest step to migrate an already existing JE application that uses Entity Manager to Spring Boot. The only thing we needed to do here is changing the unit name from movie unit to default, because there's no there's only one persistence unit in this example. Persistence XML was basically these properties have been taken and added to the application properties, and the file has been removed. And we need to add an H2 database in this case. And there should be Spring Boot starter data JPA was added. Next thing was migrating stateless session beans. What we could do here is basically replace the EJB annotations with add auto-wired. And same in the REST endpoints. And in our stateless session bean, the stateless annotation became an add service, and the transaction was added to replace container managed transactions. That's all we needed to do in this recipe. And then it's capable to be found by Spring Boot. Last and most complex migration is migrating the REST endpoints. What happened here is we basically did a one-to-one migration from a JAVAPRO REST endpoint to a Spring REST controller. Yeah, I mean, you can see what has been done, right? Post became a request mapping, pass is given on type level, which translate into request mapping annotation. And a bit more interesting, because there are more request mapping methods, is this movie is REST. As you can see, we use request mapping with request mapping get. Another recipe, for example, right, talking about migrating to best practices could be replacing request mapping with app get mapping, for example. I would see this as a separate recipe. Let me see. Something was not working. I would expect these guys here to have an required false. Let me see. Let me see if we can fix this, because otherwise the demo is going to be less successful. Yeah, I'm sorry that we are facing some turbulences here, but I had to decide between skipping this presentation and just taking what I have. So I decided to go with what I have and deal with the turbulences. Sorry, I just want to see if I can run the JAX-RS recipe again to see if then then these required false properties are set. Okay, sorry, let's not get too fancy here. What we've seen here, SBM checks that the project that we are scanning is in a clean state, meaning everything is committed. There are no resources that are not known to Git. So we're kind of using Git to understand if something changed behind the scenes, because what SBM does, it reads everything into memory, has the abstract syntax tree in memory, and then does the modifications there. And after the recipe, it checks which of these resources have been changed, just takes them and serializes them to the file system. So here SBM was telling me that, like, hey, Fabian, your Git status is not clean, and that's because I added the auto-array annotations. So it should be successful now. Here we go. Let's scan it again and see, hopefully, if it's going to add these required false. Otherwise, we're going to supplement it. Let's run this again. Oops. Yeah, it says it did it. Let's see. Okay. No, that was not successful. However, let's not get crazy here. Here it is. I don't know. The demo gods. Okay, that's what was missing, because in JAX-RS, these request parameters, basically the parameters in the URL and the end of the URL, they're optional, but in Spring they're required by default. So we need to set required false to make them optional here. Where did I stop? I think we looked into migration. There was the one-to-one mapping of the JAX-RS endpoints. So let's see if this is working. I do even clean install. Fingers crossed. That looks okay. And if I do now a Spring Boot run, fingers crossed again. The application starts up successfully. Whew. And I prepared a little HTTP file here where we can do calls. I didn't show you the calls to the movie from REST. I hope you believe me that it's actually working before. The location for the REST endpoints changed a bit. Actually, my plan would be in the end to have a live coding. I think we don't make it there, but we could solve this by providing the movie fun as like the base pass behind localhost and making this here a request pass on all REST controllers. Let's see. I'm actually not sure about my time. Maybe we make it in the end and I can live code this. Okay, so let's see if it actually works. Response body is empty. That looks good. I know it looks good. If you say get movies, hi, here we go. That's the list of movies. So that seems to be working. They're coming from a database actually, right? From our H2 database. Let's add a movie. City of God, best movie of all times. Here we go. That's our movie has been added. Oh wait, no, that was wrong. Sorry. It would have been added in Tommy. Here's our terminal. Oh. Let's see if it was added. Because here we can query our movies. And I'm not sure what's not working there. Something is not working. Response file saved. Okay, I think I messed something up in these parameters here. Let's see if we have it in our list of movies, and I would take this as a proof. Here is our City of God, right? So it was added. Apologies that this is not working. So there was a demo so far that was demoing migrating a full-blown, if you want, JE application, fairly simple though, to Spring Boot using Spring Boot Migrator. And that's what's happened behind the scenes. There's one more recipe that we could run. I mentioned we are looking into upgrades from 2.7 to 3.0 applications. So let's try to upgrade our Tommy application to 3.0. Actually, I just realized I never tried to run it. It's going to be interesting. So, so far we implemented everything to milestone 3 upgrade. Next thing is going to be milestone 4, and I hope that until November, when Spring Boot 3 comes out, we have a fairly solid set of migrations, at least for the boot core part. There are a lot of modules that need to be tackled as well, so it's going to be a lot of work. If you're interested to become an open source committer, that's your chance. Let's see what happened. Let's have the Git history again. Here's our recipe that was applied. And if you compare versions, we can see that our JavaX packages were moved to Jakarta because Spring Boot is using new Jakarta packages in version 3. All right, that's what happened here. I mean, there's not much Spring Boot in the application, so there's not much that has been migrated. The Jakarta thing is actually the only thing. But in the POM XML, we added a repository to retrieve the milestone dependencies and to retrieve the milestone plugins. Spring Boot dependencies have been updated to 3.0 milestone 3 release. JSTL is managed, so that version has been removed. It's managed by Spring Boot now. And that was actually it. Let's see. Actually, maybe I shouldn't do this, but I want to see if it works. Forgive me if it doesn't. Okay, forgive me. Application config. I'm not sure. I didn't try it before. I was maybe I shouldn't have done it. One more. Forgive me. All right. Until the next release, it's going to be out this week. I'm going to fix this, I promise. Nevertheless, I guess if you would look into it, it shouldn't be too hard. I think there's some import missing, but before I get too nervous and start crying, I would say that was the demo. I hope it gives you an understanding about how this thing works and what's happening behind the scenes, at least in parts, and how to use this tool. Let's look into the concepts a bit. What's happening behind the scenes while running these recipes. The idea or the concept that we're running recipes. That's basically the bundle that does a set of migrations, set of changes. We try to implement these recipes similar as you would do your manual migration, right? Like the steps I do manually, we try to define them in one action per thing that you need to change. So a recipe bundle is a set of actions, and each recipe and each action has a condition which defines if this recipe in total or some of the actions in the set of actions are applicable or not. And only the ones that are applicable are run. And if nothing is applicable or the recipe itself shows not applicable, it's not going to be shown in the list of applicable recipes after scanning the project. In our actions and conditions, that would be the main classes. If you want to write your own recipe, that would be the main classes you need to implement. And they have just one method. Condition is applicable and action has apply, and provided as parameters a project context. So the project context is the central point of entry into your abstract syntax tree representation. And behind this project context, you can find things like a build file to add dependencies, remove dependencies, things like these, right? There's the concept of specialized resources, things that have a certain meaning. A persistence XML, for example, it's a plain XML file, but it has a certain meaning in a sense of a JE application. So we have representations for these. Java source, obviously, something you want to have, represents a Java source file. with a set of types, and each type has a set of methods. They can have annotations, so on and so forth. EJB jar XML, another example for a specialized resource. So that's in very rough, that's the idea, and these are the main concepts behind the scenes. So if you want to create your own recipe, you need to declare these recipes. We have two ways to do them. One is a declarative YAML approach. As you can see on the right side, you need to provide a name to the recipe. That's going to be the name that we choose in the shell, at least for now. It's going to be simplified a bit in the future. You have a description. As a user, you can get descriptions for your recipes, order, which defines, okay, where in the list does this recipe show, because sometimes it's important to run recipes in a certain order. And that's how you can achieve this. The mention condition, right, that defines if the recipe name recipe is applicable or not, would be something that's implemented into some condition. And then a set of actions, similar to everything we've been before. We provide a type that's a fully qualified class name to the action that implements, in this case, adding a dependency, right? In this case, we add the dependencies Spring Framework Boot, Spring Boot Starter Web in 2.5.6 to upon XML, and again, a condition. It's important that these recipes must reside under directory /recipes inside the class path. That would allow you to start Spring Boot Migrator with your own jar containing YAML files. So without recompiling, you could probably configure new recipes. And then there's another way to do exactly the same thing, just in a different syntax, which would be we use a Spring Boot configuration class and declare a bean that returns a recipe, and inside this bean declaration, yeah, we do the same thing just with an Fluent API here. Here it's important that these classes are somewhere under org Spring Framework SBM, or you need to adjust your component scan. Obviously, upside is we have a compiler verification. We can do all sorts of programming. So personally, I tend to prefer this way here. The only drawback is you need to have this compiled into your application, basically. Yeah, don't forget to add a recipe in an action, to add a description to recipe in action. Otherwise, you're going to see null in the UI, which is doesn't hurt, but it's not nice. Okay, so that was the recipe, having these two ways to declare recipes first step, and then we would need to create conditions that we add to the recipe itself and to the actions. And it's fairly simple. It implements a condition interface. You can configure it, yeah, right? You can provide parameters that are going to be used in the evaluation phase. And then the main part here is the evaluate method, where we just return Boolean if something, for example, we found some resource, right? If you want to remove annotation foo, then it only makes sense to run this recipe if there is any annotation foo, and that's the job of these conditions. Oops, sorry. Yeah. One side note, these parameters, they can be validated using Java bean validation, and you can just add these annotations here on top. And when Spring Boot Migrator starts and creates the actions and the recipes, these are evaluated. Probably the most important class in SBM is an action. In almost all cases, it makes sense to extend from abstract action, give it a speaking name, and then these are the actions that we define inside our recipes. Again, if you have more generic recipes, like this here, remove a type action, annotation action, it makes sense to make them parameterized. Right? In this case, we can provide different annotations, and they're going to be removed if they are found. Here, you can see the apply method. We, as I mentioned, right, the context is the central entry point. We say, hey, context, give me all Java sources as a stream. Take the types of all Java sources, flat map it into a stream. So after that, we get all types in all Java sources. Then filter the types that have this annotation. Oops, and if there's any, then, sorry. And if there's any, then remove it. Right, so that could be that's how this recipe would look like. You can inject Spring Beans here. You just need to use auto-wired because these classes, they are not Spring Beans themselves, but when we create them, we interpreted the auto-wired annotations and try to inject beans if we find them. The project context itself does not offer methods for all kinds of resources. For example, you won't find a method, give me the web XML or give me a EJB deployment descriptor, because these are so-called specialized resources. And to access these, you would need to use a concept called search. You can say on the context, you can say, hey, search, and then we provide some class that implements a ResourceFinder interface, has only one method and returns a generic result. In this case, we say, okay, we return an optional spec-res, whatever spec-res is here. And if something is returned, we can operate on these methods. So if you would, for example, want to find the web XML, you could create a ResourceFinder that returns the web XML file, and there you would get not an XML file itself as return value, but a web XML file, which in our case offers you access to the JAXP generated model representing the XML, and you could like take information out of this web XML and use it for your migrations to, I don't know, put it somewhere else, for example, the information that you extracted. Yeah, different finders exist. They're getting more and more because they're kind of helpful. If you want to see what's there, best bet is use ResourceFinder and look at the type hierarchy and try to find out which are the resource finders that provide you the resource that you need. I mentioned it's possible to run OpenRewrite recipes from inside Spring Boot Migrator. We have different representations of resources, and some of them have a so-called apply and maybe a find method. Apply actually does a modification, right? Like the resulting resource looks differently than the first one, than the given resource. But there's also something that's just finding something. It doesn't really change something. It just gives you something back. And in OpenRewrite recipe, in OpenRewrite, these are different things. So you can do apply to provide a recipe to change something, or find to get back some results. Depending on which level or on which resource representation you call these methods, the set of resources that are provided to the migration differs, right? Project Java sources, all Java sources will be provided to this recipe. Java source set, which is, for example, representing all sources in some module source main Java, just takes these files. Java source, only the Java source you provide, and type build file, same thing. So in this case here, we would get the Java sources in this example and then apply some OpenRewrite recipe, which is actually the recipe coming from OpenRewrite. We put it on class by depending on the job, and then it would do our changes, and we could afterwards try to get the results and see if changes are applied or work with them. There are two other things that we added recently. It's possible to add OpenRewrite recipes inside our declarative YAML syntax, the first slide that we've seen. I don't have a slide here, but if you look into the source code, you're going to find it. That makes it possible for us to integrate the recipes that OpenRewrite offers one-to-one into SBM. And actually, we're working closely with them and try to put as much migrations into their code base as possible, so users of OpenRewrite can use their excellent framework and benefit from recipes that we provide. Testing, really important. You won't get far without testing. It's very cumbersome to test all this stuff manually. It takes quite some time. So we created a test harness. It's called TestProjectContext. The cumbersome bit in these tests is creating a representation of the scanned project. And we didn't want to scan the file system every time. So this TestProjectContext allows you to create a test project context with synthetic resources. They don't really exist. We just provide a path to the resource and the content of the file, basically, an add project resource would add this here as a resource. Basically not a good idea. It would probably be add Java source. So that's what you can do. Many times for type resolution, you want to have the right types on the class path, otherwise things won't work, right? You can do this, for example, with this with build file having dependencies method, and then a POM XML is created behind the scenes. The dependencies are resolved. And if you use one of the types in this dependency, for example, in the Java source code, then these types can be resolved. It probably makes sense to look into the API, but that's something you want to know about if you plan to create an action or recipe. Anything I missed? No. Yeah, support for specialized resources. Oops. Maybe important, I mentioned the specialized resources, they need something, they need a specialized class which finds them. And if you don't provide it to this test harness, you won't have them. So for example, if you need have an EJB deployment descriptor, you need to provide the matching class that adds it. If you look into some of the existing tests, you're going to find to see how this works. Okay. Maybe worth mentioning a few words, why does Spring Boot Migrator exist at all if there's OpenRewrite, which does, as I mentioned, an excellent job doing this stuff. It's a very, very powerful framework. I think there are some reasons for this. First of all, it's like historically we started before OpenRewrite was there. And back in the past, we had sometimes different opinions how things should work. I think the biggest difference is that from our perspective, our meaning SBM's perspective, we don't see that you run a recipe and everything is magically translated and works just out of the box as in this demo, more or less. We have a different philosophy. Our thinking is that it's still very valuable to just do parts of the migration. Imagine you have an application with 60 EJBs and you need to migrate them all to Spring services. That's going to be something that's easily done with Spring Boot Migrator, but it's going to be painful doing it by hand. And with search and replace, believe me, you won't get too far. So there we have a different opinion, right? And OpenRewrite really targets full migration. They offer a SaaS offering, very powerful SaaS offering. Give it a try. It's free for open source projects. And if you have a commercial project, then your best bet is to use maybe no Gradle plugin to do these things. On our end, on the other side, we started with the shell. We're working on IDE integration with STS. Actually, my colleague Alex Boyko created the STS integration for OpenRewrite already. So it's not a lie, but it's only half true. STS could be here as well. Very different is the API. As I mentioned, we have these action, right, where everything happens and you could extract something out of the project context, keep it in a variable, use it later on. Very different in OpenRewrite. They have everything they do is done with visitors, right? They're visiting the abstract syntax tree, going from node to node. And if you want to have information from one node that you visit in another node, you have to put this information into basically a generic map and then extract it from there again. And on our side, it's very different. We would keep these things in variables. I think SBM is very, very narrow, right? We have a very limited problem space. OpenRewrite is very broad. They look at a lot of things from COBOL migration to Kubernetes, YAML file migrations, to you name it, right? And on our side, it's very limited. And in the past, this allowed us to do things sometimes differently, sometimes maybe earlier, and then they went into rewrite, or right, we had a lot of freedom to do things the way we wanted. So that's kind of how I would explain why SBM still exists. We built on top of OpenRewrite. We work closely with them, and yeah, this abstraction allowed us to do some things differently. Looking at the time, it's 9:46. Coding would have been here. Actually, honestly, I think I won't do the live coding now. Maybe use these 3 minutes to see if we have questions. One thing, maybe quickly, what's ahead, roadmap. We are heavily working on multi-module support to scan applications and actually migrate applications with, I don't know, a set of modules. As I mentioned, Spring Boot 3 upgrade is top goal right now until the release in November. STS integration is something we're going to look into. I started reworking the shell integration. I just didn't manage to finish it until this presentation. I want to split this whole thing into artifacts. Right now we are releasing only on GitHub. So these things and these modules should go to Maven Central, so you can build your own applications on top of what's there. YAML support is missing. We're only working with properties. I want to provide more support for Spring-related resources, and something else on the list is AOT guidance. So if you want to have a cloud-native application, Spring-native application, that's something that's going to tell you like where you have maybe problematic spots. Okay, 47. I think can't see any questions in the chat. Maybe, as I said, any more questions? Maybe we can. Not sure if you can unmute yourself. Okay. No questions? I can't. Is anyone talking? I can't hear anything.
There are some questions in the chat.
When to expect an alpha version? Okay, I just came. Thanks. Serafima, thanks for your question. Actually, Spring 1 is coming in November, and until then, I would expect a release that's more stable than the one right now. I just realized yesterday we've been working for 4 months without releasing anything, so I promise I'm going to do this week, and that's probably something you should go look into. Then Sylvie asks if SBM supports Gradle. Unfortunately, no. As I mentioned, OpenRewrite does the heavy lifting, right? We're just using what they did. I looked into their Gradle support so far. This would basically mean they have like a limited support for Gradle. That would be doable. It would basically mean migrating the Groovy scripts that define the Gradle build file. So if that's important for you and you want to be open source committer, good chance to talk to the people at OpenRewrite and they will help you out. But it's on the list. It's just going to take some while. Will the 2.0 include a migration for Spring Security without WP? Yes, that's what at least the plan is, to support full release nodes as they're provided for Spring Boot project, plus Spring Data, as we think that's one of the most used modules, plus Spring Security. So yeah, that's the plan. And Hannes, I hope it will be there in October, November. Guillaume, thank you. Happy to hear that. I was not sure if it's going to be very bumpy or just bumpy. Okay, I think we get 9:49, 48. Thank you, everyone. Thanks. I would be really, really glad if you want to become open source committer, come into this. We're an easy bunch of people, not many crazy rules and things. So I think if you ever thought about becoming open source committer, drop me a line, come to GitHub, add something to the discussions. We are all experimenting what works best. I would be very glad to see one of you. Thank you.